There are a bunch of kids walking by my door from the preschool. Okay. They're gone, but you can probably still hear them. So cute. Hi, Internet. My name's Jeff. I'm a pastor. I was away last week. I missed you. You look great. Most recently, in the Bible study that I've been teaching, we've been going through the Bible and talking about each of the passages that talk about homosexuality. And this last week, 2 nights ago, I'm recording this on a Friday. You didn't need to know that. 2 nights ago, we 2 nights ago we talked about Jesus. Good guy to talk about. Let's get to it. Let's start with a diagram. So, if you take a look at this diagram, you will see the way that they believed the world, the universe, was constructed in the ancient world in Jesus' time. So, it all started with some pillars, and on top of those pillars that they called the pillars of the earth, there was a bowl of water. They called those waters the waters below. Floating on that was some land, and on top of that bowl was a big dome. And guess what was up in the dome? It was stars, because that dome was the sky. And also the sun and the moon. And in that dome, there were built in some floodgates to let out what's stored in this upper tank of water called the waters above. And then on top of all of this, there is a throne. In case you couldn't tell, I made this diagram when I first discovered the animations on Keynote. So on top of that tank, there's a very poorly drawn throne, and that throne is where God sits, or the gods sit, depending on what worldview you have. So this would be the picture that people had in their minds when somebody was talking about the way that the world was constructed. So if you read through Genesis, for example, and you read through the creation narrative, you'll find at one point that God separates the waters above from the waters below. Well, it's talking about the waters above in that tank on top of the dome, and the waters below where the land is. Now, if you take a look at this diagram, you might think, oh, how very primitive. And I'm not showing it to you so that we can make fun of it or make fun of how primitive people were, their understanding was in the ancient world, because really that's a pretty brilliant diagram when you think about it. I mean, it just makes sense for people living in that time using their observational skills. But now that we have a little bit more information, now that we've, been up and we didn't bump into a tank of water, now that we have a little bit more information, we understand things differently and we don't abide by that diagram anymore. That isn't the way that we see the world. We don't believe that the earth is flat unless you're Kanye West. And sorry, I had to. And so this just isn't something that we believe in anymore. But I want to take a look at this passage in the Gospel of Mark. This is from Mark chapter 13, and it's verses 24 through 27. Jesus says, "But in those days after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out angels and gather his elect from the four winds and from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven." Now, notice what Jesus is doing here. Jesus is using language from that diagram that we just saw, right? So we see things like the ends of the earth and the ends of heaven. Well, nowadays, we believe that the earth is round. Most of us believe that the earth is round. Science says the earth is round. We have more information than they did back then, and so we believe that the earth is round. So as far as like ends of earth, ends of heaven, we don't really believe that anymore. We believe that the universe is expanding. We believe that the earth is round, and so there are no ends to it. And yet, Jesus uses the ancient language and the ancient images in order to speak to ancient people. That's the precedent that Jesus establishes. He uses ancient words, ancient customs, and an ancient mindset in order to speak to ancient people, to speak to them on their own terms, basically. Now, this seems irrelevant, but it's actually extremely relevant for our conversation about the Bible and homosexuality, because very often non-affirming people will point to this one passage in Mark chapter 10, where Jesus seems to assume that the norm is for men to marry women and women to marry men. In other words, Jesus assumes heterosexuality, and that heterosexuality is built into the created order. So the passage that people will often refer to is Mark chapter 10. Again, it's verses 2 through 12, and in it Jesus is talking about divorce. So some Pharisees come to Jesus to test him, and they ask, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" And Jesus answered them, "What did Moses command you?" And the Pharisees said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her." But Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. But from the beginning of creation," and this is what people will point out, this is the emphasized part right here, "but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." And I am going to keep on going here, even though we've gotten past the relevant parts of the passage for our discussion, but I do want to keep on going. Verse 10 in Mark 10. "Then in the house, the disciples asked Jesus again about this matter. He said to them, 'Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery.'" Now, once again, non-affirming people will point to this passage and say, see, Jesus assumes that it's written in the created order that men marry women and women marry men. Jesus assumes heterosexuality and believes that it's built into the fabric of creation itself. But if you make that argument, it's going to get problematic very quickly. Because if your argument is Jesus assumed it when he was giving examples, therefore we need to assume it ourselves and believe that it's built into the fabric of creation, then we also kind of need to believe in a flat earth. Because after all, Jesus does assume a flat earth when he's talking in Mark chapter 13. So again, you can make the argument, see, Jesus says that it's written into the fabric of creation itself that heterosexuality is the only true marriage, the only true marriage bond. If you make that argument, which you absolutely can, I disagree with you, but if you make that argument, then you also kind of have to reconcile why you don't assume that the earth is flat as well. And maybe you can make the argument, well, I just believe what's in this passage. I'm just assuming the relational stuff. Well, if you're assuming the relational stuff, then you also have to reconcile why, and I think that a lot of us, again, myself included, why we don't believe in the strictness of this marriage stuff anymore. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Well, we just don't believe that anymore. Even in the church, we don't believe that anymore. So why do we assume that what's said about same-sex relationships is binding, but not necessarily the stuff about divorce? Again, this is all stuff that I'm just pointing out that you need to reconcile if you're going to assume that Jesus assumes heterosexuality in this passage, therefore heterosexuality is binding for all of eternity. Now, I'd like to get into all of that divorce stuff because I think that this passage is doing more than just being really heavy-handed about divorce, but that's kind of for another video. You can email me if you think that that's interesting or if you think that I should do a video on that or something like that. But just for the sake of our conversation today, I simply want to make the point that that argument about Jesus assumes that heterosexuality is built into the fabric of creation, therefore we need to believe that heterosexuality is the only way, and therefore it's built into the fabric of creation. If you want to make that argument, as we've been saying every week, you've got some reconciling to do, and you've got a lot of work that you need to do. Like, why don't we believe in the divorce stuff anymore with the strictness with which it's laid out if you take the passage literalistically? And Jesus also assumes when he's speaking to ancient people that the earth is flat, so why don't you argue that the earth is flat anymore? We've got some explaining to do there. Instead, I think that what we have going on here is, once again, Jesus is speaking to an ancient audience. And because he's speaking to an ancient audience, he's going to use ancient language, ancient understandings of things, ancient symbol sets. Jesus could very well have said, therefore a man or woman will leave his father and mother, or her father, or her mother, and be joined to his wife, or her wife, or his husband, or her husband. Jesus could have said all that. But those weren't things that were common in the ancient world, and since he was talking to ancient people, it would have gone over their heads, the same way that if he had talked about around Earth, it would have gone over their heads. He's using ancient symbols to connect with ancient people, and therefore we don't need to bring that ancient symbol set and canonize it in our world. Instead, we can get to the heart of the passage rather than canonizing that symbol set, that ancient symbol set. We can use a modern symbol set as modern people and not take away from the overall message that Jesus is giving here. All right, that's it. We have one more session, possibly one more video. I don't know if I'm going to do another video on the last session because it's going to be a little bit more conversational, but maybe you'll see it, maybe you won't. I don't know. So yeah, maybe see you next week, possibly. Maybe we'll talk about the divorce thing. Maybe we should just do more videos about different things. Anyway, let me know. Comment, like, all the YouTube things. Grace and peace, everybody.